The morning mist clung to the iron gates of Buckingham Palace like ghostly fingers, refusing to lift despite the warm September sun that painted the London sky in shades of gold and amber. Tourist buses rumbled past the Victoria Memorial, their diesel engines mixing with the excited chatter of visitors from every corner of the world. Among them walked Marcus Thompson, a man whose life had taken so many wrong turns that he could no longer remember what the right path looked like. Marcus pressed his hands deeper into the pockets of his worn leather jacket, feeling the familiar weight of emptiness where his wallet should have been. At 34, his face bore the premature lines of someone who had lived through more hardship than most people twice his age. His dark hair, unkempt and greasy, fell across hollow cheeks that hadn't seen a proper meal in days. The stubble on his jaw was patchy and uneven, a testament to the cheap razors he occasionally shoplifted from corner stores when desperation drove him to it. As he approached the magnificent palace gates, Marcus couldn't help but feel the bitter irony of his situation. Here stood the symbol of everything he had never been able to achieve: wealth, stability, respect, a place in society that meant something. The golden facade gleamed in the morning light, each window reflecting back his own worthless image like 1,000 mirrors showing him what he would never become. The tourists around him snapped photos with expensive cameras, their designer clothes and confident laughter creating a stark contrast to his own shabby appearance. Children clutched their parents' hands while pointing excitedly at the famous red-coated guards, their innocent wonder a painful reminder of a childhood Marcus barely remembered. His own youth had been consumed by a cycle of foster homes, juvenile detention centers, and brief stints of freedom that always ended with another arrest, another disappointed social worker, another closed door. Standing perfectly still at his post, Guardsman James Mitchell represented everything Marcus had always envied. At 26, James possessed the kind of quiet dignity that came from knowing exactly who he was and what he stood for. His scarlet tunic was immaculate, every brass button polished to mirror brightness, his bearskin hat positioned with military precision. The weight of his ceremonial rifle, an SA-80A2, rested comfortably in his white-gloved hands, hands that had never known the desperate hunger that drove men to steal, never felt the cold metal of handcuffs, never trembled with the withdrawal that came from substances used to forget. James had grown up in a small village in Yorkshire, where his father worked as a mechanic and his mother taught at the local primary school. Their modest two-bedroom house had been filled with love, encouragement, and the steady rhythm of ordinary life that Marcus had never experienced. Sunday dinners around the kitchen table, help with homework, bedtime stories, these simple privileges had shaped James into a man who understood duty, honor, and service to something greater than himself. The decision to join the Queen's Guard had come naturally to James. After completing his A-levels, he had spent months researching different career paths, but nothing had called to him quite like the opportunity to serve the crown. The rigorous training at the Infantry Training Center had been challenging but rewarding, teaching him not just the physical skills required for his role, but the mental discipline that came with being entrusted to protect Britain's most sacred traditions. Now, as he stood motionless in front of the palace, James was acutely aware of the responsibility that rested on his shoulders. The rifle he carried was not merely ceremonial, it was a fully functional weapon, loaded and ready to defend the royal residence if necessary. The tourists who posed for pictures beside him had no idea that beneath his stoic exterior, he remained constantly vigilant, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of threat or unusual behavior. Marcus had been watching James for over an hour, studying the guard's routine, timing his movements, calculating possibilities that grew more desperate with each passing minute. His stomach cramped with hunger, a gnawing emptiness that had become his constant companion over the past 3 days. His last meal had been scraps found in a restaurant's garbage bin, and even that meager sustenance was now a fading memory. The voices in Marcus's head had started again that morning, whispering suggestions that grew louder as his desperation deepened. They weren't the voices of mental illness, he was painfully sane, but rather the accumulated weight of a lifetime of bad choices and worse luck. Every failed job interview, every rejected application for benefits, every door slammed in his face had added another voice to the chorus that now urged him toward increasingly dangerous solutions. He had tried the legitimate route so many times that the rejection letters could have wallpapered a small room. His criminal record made him unemployable in most fields, and the few jobs that didn't require background checks paid so little that he couldn't afford even the most basic accommodation. The cycle was vicious and unrelenting. Without an address, he couldn't get a job. without a job, he couldn't get an address; without either, he slowly starved while society looked through him as if he were invisible. The idea had first occurred to Marcus 3 days earlier when he had seen a news report about military equipment being sold on the black market. The journalist had mentioned astronomical prices paid for authentic weapons, numbers that made Marcus's head spin with possibility. A single rifle could solve all his problems: rent a room, buy food, maybe even start fresh somewhere far away from the London streets that had become his prison. As he watched James stand perfectly still, Marcus found himself studying every detail of the guard's equipment. The rifle was beautiful in its lethal simplicity, its black polymer stock gleaming dully in the morning light. The weapon looked heavy but manageable, and Marcus had handled firearms before during his brief stint in a gang during his early 20s. He knew enough about guns to recognize quality when he saw it, and everything about James's equipment spoke of precision engineering and military-grade construction. The crowds around the palace provided perfect cover for Marcus's reconnaissance. He could blend in with the tourists, moving from position to position while observing the guards' rotation schedule, noting when they were most vulnerable, identifying the brief moments when their attention might be divided. Security cameras dotted the area, their electronic eyes recording everything, but Marcus had learned long ago how to move through London's surveillance network without attracting attention. As the morning wore on, Marcus noticed the subtle signs of fatigue beginning to show in James's posture. Standing motionless for hours was more physically demanding than most people realized, and even the best-trained soldiers were still human. The guard's breathing became slightly more visible, his grip on the rifle shifted almost imperceptibly, and tiny beads of perspiration formed beneath the edge of his bearskin hat despite the cool morning air. These observations filled Marcus with a mixture of anticipation and self-loathing. He hated what he was planning, hated the desperation that had driven him to consider such an act, but the alternative was slowly starving to death on London's unforgiving streets. He had tried begging, had swallowed his pride and approached strangers with outstretched hands, only to be met with disgust, fear, or indifference. Society had made its judgment about people like him, and that judgment was final and absolute. The tourists continued their endless parade of photographs and selfies, their joy and excitement creating a bizarre backdrop for Marcus's dark contemplations. A group of Japanese visitors bowed respectfully to James before taking pictures, their courtesy and politeness highlighting the vast cultural gulf between their ordered society and Marcus's chaotic existence. Children dragged their parents closer to the guards, their faces bright with wonder at seeing real-life soldiers in their magnificent uniforms. Marcus remembered being that age once, remembered the brief period when he had still believed that good things were possible, that heroes were real, that the world made sense. That innocence had been stripped away layer by layer, first by his father's abandonment when Marcus was 7, then by his mother's descent into alcoholism and drug abuse, finally, by the foster care system that had treated him like damaged goods to be warehoused rather than a child who needed love and guidance. By the time Marcus turned 18 and aged out of the system, he had already accumulated a juvenile record that made legitimate opportunities nearly impossible to find. A series of increasingly serious crimes had followed: shoplifting, burglary, drug dealing, each conviction making his situation worse, each stint in prison teaching him new skills that were useful only for breaking the law. The system that was supposed to rehabilitate him had instead created a perfect criminal, someone with no legal options and no hope of redemption. Now, as he stood in the shadow of Buckingham Palace planning his most audacious crime yet, Marcus couldn't escape the symbolism of his situation. Here was the seat of British justice and tradition, protected by men who embodied everything he could never become, guarded by weapons that represented the power he had never possessed. In a few hours, if his plan succeeded, he would cross a line that could never be uncrossed, transforming from a petty criminal into someone who had dared to threaten the crown itself. The weight of that realization should have deterred him, but hunger and desperation had eroded his capacity for rational thought. The voices in his head grew stronger as the day progressed, drowning out the faint whispers of his better angels. He began to imagine the moment when he would make his move, visualizing each step of the plan that was still forming in his mind like a dark flower blooming in poisoned soil. As afternoon approached and the guard rotation drew near, Marcus felt his heartbeat accelerate. Soon, James would be relieved by a fresh soldier, and, in that brief moment of transition, there might be an opportunity that would change both their lives forever. The die was cast, the decision made, and Marcus Thompson prepared to step out of the shadows and into a destiny that neither he nor anyone else could have predicted. The palace stood unchanged, its golden walls reflecting the same sunlight that had witnessed 1,000 years of British history, but today would be different. Today, desperation would collide with duty, and the consequences would ripple far beyond anything either man could imagine. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything James had been trained to defend and everything Marcus had left to lose. In the distance, church bells chimed the hour, their bronze voices carrying across London like a countdown to chaos. The tourists continued their cheerful chatter, unaware that they were about to become witnesses to an event that would challenge their assumptions about security, justice, and the thin line that separates order from anarchy. The morning mist had finally lifted, revealing a crystal-clear afternoon that would soon be clouded by consequences no one could foresee. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his decision settle into his bones like winter frost. There was no turning back now. The die had been cast, and whatever happened next would be written in the permanent ink of police records and newspaper headlines. He stepped forward into the crowd, his destination clear, his purpose fixed, his future balanced on the edge of a blade sharper than any ceremonial sword. The afternoon sun reached its zenith, casting sharp shadows across the palace courtyard where duty and desperation would soon meet in a collision that would change everything. The countdown had begun, and neither Marcus Thompson nor Guardsman James Mitchell could stop what was coming next. History was about to be made, one desperate act at a time, in front of the most famous palace in the world. The afternoon sun had reached its peak when Marcus made his final decision. The weight of 3 days without a proper meal had left him lightheaded, and the constant gnawing in his stomach had evolved into something beyond simple hunger. It was a desperate, clawing need that overshadowed every rational thought. As he watched the steady stream of tourists flowing past the palace gates, Marcus felt like a predator studying a herd, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. James Mitchell had been standing at his post for nearly 2 hours, and Marcus had memorized every detail of the guard's routine. Every 15 minutes, James would shift his weight almost imperceptibly from his left foot to his right. Every 30 minutes, his eyes would complete a slow, methodical scan of the immediate area. Every hour, he would blink deliberately 3 times in succession, a technique Marcus had read about online that guards used to keep their eyes moist during long periods of standing still. The knowledge felt like power in Marcus's desperate hands. For once in his life, he was the one with information, the one with a plan, the one who might actually succeed at something significant. The irony wasn't lost on him that his first real success might also be his last act as a free man. But freedom had become a relative concept when the alternative was slowly starving to death on London's indifferent streets. Marcus had spent the morning observing not just James, but the entire security apparatus that surrounded Buckingham Palace. The armed police officers who patrolled in pairs, their bulletproof vests bulky beneath their high-visibility jackets, seemed more focused on watching for suspicious vehicles than monitoring the behavior of individual tourists. The CCTV cameras that dotted every corner and lamppost were impressive in their coverage, but Marcus had learned during his years on the street that there was a significant difference between recording a crime and preventing one. The changing of the guard ceremony was scheduled for 2:30 p.m., still more than an hour away. Marcus couldn't wait that long, his nerve was already beginning to fray at the edges, and he knew that hesitation was the enemy of action. He needed to make his move soon, while the adrenaline was still flowing and before his survival instincts could override his desperation. As he moved closer to James's position, Marcus felt his heart rate increase dramatically. The familiar cocktail of fear and excitement that had preceded every major crime in his past was flooding his system with chemicals that sharpened his focus while simultaneously making his hands tremble. He forced himself to breathe slowly and deliberately, using a technique he had learned during a brief stint in anger management classes that the court had mandated after his last assault charge. The tourists around him continued their cheerful oblivion, snapping photos and chattering in dozens of different languages. A group of American college students was taking turns posing next to the palace gates, their expensive cameras and designer clothes a painful reminder of the opportunities Marcus had never been given. Their casual wealth, worn so unconsciously, made his shabby appearance feel even more pronounced. James, for his part, remained the picture of professional composure. His scarlet tunic was still immaculate despite the hours of standing, his white gloves showed no sign of perspiration, and his grip on the SA-80A2 rifle remained steady and sure. The weapon itself was a thing of beauty, all clean lines and military precision, its weight distributed perfectly for maximum control and accuracy. Marcus had done enough research online to know that the rifle was worth several £1,000s on the black market, possibly more if he could find the right buyer. The plan that had been forming in Marcus's mind was simple in its audacity. He would approach James as if he were just another tourist seeking a photo opportunity, then make his move when he was close enough to grab the rifle. The element of surprise would be crucial. Guards were trained to handle many different types of threats, but they weren't expecting someone to simply walk up and attempt to take their weapon in broad daylight surrounded by hundreds of witnesses. Marcus knew the plan was desperate to the point of being suicidal, but desperation had become his natural state. Every legitimate option had been exhausted months ago. The job center had stopped returning his calls, the housing office had placed him on waiting lists that stretched into years, and the various charities that were supposed to help people like him were overwhelmed and underfunded. Society had essentially written him off as expendable, so why should he continue to respect its rules? As he drew closer to James's position, Marcus noticed more details about the guard's equipment that might prove useful. The rifle's safety mechanism appeared to be engaged, which would buy him precious seconds if he could actually manage to get his hands on the weapon. The sling that secured it to James's body looked substantial but not impossible to overcome. Most importantly, the guard's attention seemed focused on a group of rowdy teenagers who were testing the boundaries of appropriate behavior about 20 feet away. The teenagers were exactly the kind of distraction Marcus needed. They were taking increasingly bold photos, inching closer to the guard rope barriers and making jokes about trying to make James laugh or flinch. Their behavior was annoying but not quite threatening enough to warrant intervention, which meant James was dedicating mental resources to monitoring them while maintaining his stoic facade. Marcus positioned himself among a cluster of tourists who were waiting for their turn to take photos with the guard. The group included a family from Australia, complete with matching souvenir t-shirts and a camera that looked expensive enough to feed Marcus for a month. The parents were coaching their children on how to pose respectfully, teaching them about the history and significance of the Queen's Guard tradition. Listening to their conversation, Marcus felt a stab of something that might have been guilt if he had allowed himself to experience such emotions. These people respected James, admired what he represented, saw him as a symbol of something noble and enduring. Marcus was about to shatter that illusion, to turn their pleasant holiday memory into a nightmare that would probably make international news. But guilt was a luxury Marcus could no longer afford. He had tried playing by society's rules, had genuinely attempted to rebuild his life through legitimate means multiple times over the years. Each failure had been met with lectures about personal responsibility, suggestions that he simply wasn't trying hard enough, implications that his circumstances were entirely his own fault. The system had no empathy for people who fell through its cracks, so Marcus had gradually learned to reciprocate that lack of compassion. As the Australian family finished their photos and moved away, Marcus found himself in the perfect position. He was less than 6 feet from James, close enough to see the tiny details that humanized the stoic figure, a small scar above his left eyebrow, probably from childhood, the way his nostrils flared slightly with each controlled breath, the almost imperceptible tension in his jaw muscles that suggested concentration rather than relaxation. For a moment, Marcus hesitated. James looked so young, so earnest in his dedication to duty. The guard had probably grown up in some comfortable middle-class family, attended good schools, never known real hunger or homelessness or the kind of desperation that turned ordinary people into criminals. He was exactly the kind of person Marcus had once hoped to become before life had beaten that hope out of him with relentless efficiency. But the hesitation lasted only seconds before hunger reasserted its dominance over conscience. Marcus's stomach cramped viciously, reminding him of exactly why he was here and what was at stake. He had already lost everything that mattered: his family, his home, his prospects, his dignity. The only thing left to lose was his life, and that was happening slowly anyway through malnutrition and exposure. Marcus began to move forward, his steps casual but purposeful. He held up his phone as if preparing to take a selfie with the famous guard, just another tourist capturing a moment for social media. James's eyes flickered toward him briefly, making the professional assessment that every guard made dozens of times per hour. Was this person a potential threat or just another harmless visitor? The evaluation lasted perhaps half a second before James's attention returned to the broader crowd. Marcus appeared to fit the profile of countless other tourists who had approached for photos, slightly disheveled perhaps, but not in a way that suggested danger. The guards' training focused on identifying weapons, suspicious behavior, and obvious threats. Someone who looked like they might be homeless wasn't automatically classified as dangerous in the context of central London, where such individuals were unfortunately common. That momentary dismissal was exactly what Marcus had been counting on. Society's tendency to overlook the poor and desperate would work in his favor for once, providing the camouflage he needed to get close enough to make his move. He was banking on the fact that James would be watching for terrorists, political activists, or mentally disturbed individuals, not a petty criminal desperate enough to attempt something so audacious that it bordered on the absurd. Marcus raised his phone higher, angling it as if trying to get both himself and James in the frame. This movement brought him even closer to the guard, close enough now that he could smell the faint aroma of military-grade fabric conditioner that kept James's uniform crisp and clean. Close enough to see the almost microscopic dust motes that had settled on the guard's polished boots despite the constant attention to detail that military life demanded. The rifle was right there, solid and real and worth more money than Marcus had seen in years. Its black polymer stock gleamed dully in the afternoon sunlight, and the metal components showed the kind of maintenance that only came from military discipline. This weapon represented salvation, not just financial, but psychological. Successfully taking it would prove that Marcus was still capable of something significant, that he hadn't become completely invisible to the world. James remained perfectly still, his breathing controlled and his grip on the rifle steady. He was the product of months of intensive training designed to prepare him for exactly this kind of moment, though his instructors had probably never imagined a scenario quite like the one that was about to unfold. The guard's muscle memory was programmed to respond to clear and obvious threats, sudden movements, visible weapons, aggressive behavior. What none of his training had specifically prepared him for was someone who would approach him with the patience of a predator, using the guard's own professionalism against him. Marcus was counting on the fact that James's commitment to maintaining his stoic composure would create a brief window of vulnerability, a moment when surprise could overcome training. The crowd around them continued its constant chatter and movement, creating the perfect background noise to mask what Marcus was planning. Children laughed, cameras clicked, tour guides explained historical facts in multiple languages. It was the sound of normal life, of people enjoying a pleasant afternoon in one of London's most famous locations. None of them suspected that they were about to witness something that would make headlines around the world. Marcus lowered his phone slightly, pretending to check the image quality while actually calculating angles and distances. The rifle's sling appeared to be designed for security but also for quick release in case James needed to bring the weapon into action rapidly. That dual purpose might work in Marcus's favor if he could figure out the mechanism quickly enough. Time seemed to slow as Marcus made his final preparations. His entire life had led to this moment, every bad decision, every missed opportunity, every door that had been slammed in his face. This was his chance to prove that Marcus Thompson still existed, that he was still capable of making things happen rather than simply having things happen to him. The afternoon sun cast sharp shadows across the palace courtyard, and, somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed the quarter hour. In a few seconds, Marcus would step across a line that could never be uncrossed, transforming himself from a desperate man into someone who had dared to threaten the crown itself. The weight of that decision should have paralyzed him, but hunger had burned away his capacity for such considerations. Marcus took a deep breath, tasting the pollution-tinged London air one last time as a free man. Then, with movements that were both lightning-quick and surprisingly gentle, he lunged forward toward James and the rifle that represented his last hope of salvation. The die was cast, and the afternoon that had started so peacefully was about to explode into chaos that no one could control. The moment Marcus's hands made contact with the rifle, time fractured into a series of crystal-clear snapshots that would be burned into his memory forever. First, there was the shocking coldness of the metal against his palms, far colder than he had expected despite the warm afternoon sun. Second, there was the immediate resistance of the weapon's sling system, which proved far more sophisticated than his hurried observations had suggested. Third, and most surprising, was the explosive speed of James Mitchell's reaction. Training kicked in before conscious thought could interfere. James's body responded with muscle memory drilled into him through countless hours of repetitive exercises designed to handle exactly this type of unexpected threat. His grip on the rifle tightened instantly, his stance shifted to a more stable position, and his free hand moved to prevent the weapon from being dislodged from his control. The entire response took less than a second, but, in that compressed time frame, both men's lives changed forever. Marcus felt his initial surge of confidence evaporate as he realized he had drastically underestimated both the complexity of the rifle's attachment system and the guard's speed of response. What he had imagined as a quick grab-and-run operation immediately transformed into a desperate struggle for control of a weapon that seemed determined to remain exactly where it was. The rifle's sling wasn't simply decorative, it was a professional security system designed by people who had spent considerable time thinking about exactly this scenario. The first sound that escaped from the struggle was a sharp intake of breath from James, followed immediately by Marcus's grunt of effort as he tried to wrench the weapon free. These sounds, small as they were, cut through the ambient noise of tourist chatter and street traffic like gunshots. Heads began to turn, conversations faltered, and the general atmosphere of relaxed sightseeing started to shift toward something more alert and concerned. James's training had covered many scenarios, but the reality of someone actually attempting to take his weapon was more visceral and chaotic than any simulation could have prepared him for. The physical contact was shockingly intimate. He could smell Marcus's unwashed clothes, feel the desperation in the man's grip, sense the barely controlled panic that was driving this audacious attack. For a split second, James found himself looking directly into Marcus's eyes and seeing something that was both utterly alien and disturbingly human. Marcus's eyes held a wildness that spoke of someone who had absolutely nothing left to lose. They were the eyes of a cornered animal, but also of a man who had been pushed so far beyond his breaking point that normal considerations of risk and consequence had ceased to apply. James had seen similar expressions before, during his deployment training, in the faces of enemy combatants who knew they were about to die but were determined to take someone with them. But this wasn't a battlefield in some foreign country, this was central London, surrounded by families on holiday and pensioners out for afternoon walks. The cognitive dissonance of facing a desperate enemy in such a peaceful setting created a moment of hesitation that Marcus was quick to exploit. He shifted his grip on the rifle, trying to use his body weight to break James's hold on the weapon. The struggle intensified as both men realized that this was no longer a question of simple theft. Marcus was fighting for what he believed was his only chance at survival, while James was defending not just a piece of military equipment, but everything he had sworn to protect. The rifle became a symbol of competing worldviews. Marcus saw it as salvation, while James saw it as a sacred trust that could never be surrendered. Tourists who had been posing for photos moments earlier now found themselves witnessing something that belonged in an action movie rather than their pleasant afternoon outing. Cameras that had been capturing smiling family portraits suddenly swung toward the unfolding drama, their owners unsure whether they should be documenting what they were seeing or looking for the nearest exit. A woman from the Australian family Marcus had observed earlier screamed, not loudly, but with the sharp pitch of genuine alarm. Her husband immediately stepped in front of their children, creating a human shield while trying to decide whether to move closer to help or further away to ensure their safety. The children, too young to fully understand what was happening, sensed the adult panic around them and began to cry. The sound of crying children seemed to galvanize other bystanders into action. A group of German tourists who had been admiring the palace architecture suddenly found themselves facing a moral choice about whether to intervene in what appeared to be an assault on a member of the Queen's Guard. Their leader, a middle-aged man who had served in the Bundeswehr decades earlier, began moving toward the struggle with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested military training. Marcus felt the noose of consequences tightening around his neck with each passing second. What had begun as a desperate but calculated risk was rapidly spiraling into a public spectacle that would make escape impossible. He could hear the sounds of alarm spreading through the crowd like ripples in a pond, voices rising in pitch and volume as more people became aware that something serious was happening. But abandoning his plan now would mean returning to the slow death of starvation and homelessness that had driven him to this point. The rifle remained tantalizingly close, its potential value representing the difference between continued suffering and a chance at a new life. Marcus redoubled his efforts, using techniques he had learned during his brief involvement with a gang that specialized in muggings and street robberies. James, meanwhile, was drawing on every aspect of his training to maintain control of the situation. His instructors had taught him that losing his weapon would be catastrophic not just for him personally, but for the security of everything he was sworn to protect. The rifle in his hands was more than metal and plastic, it was a symbol of the Crown's authority, and allowing it to be taken would represent a failure that could never be forgiven. The physical struggle between the two men was becoming more intense by the second. Marcus's desperation gave him strength that his malnourished frame shouldn't have been able to generate, while James's military conditioning provided him with endurance and technique that civilian criminals rarely encountered. Neither man was willing to yield, and their competing determination was creating a deadlock that could only be resolved through the intervention of outside forces. Those forces were already mobilizing with the efficiency that came from years of preparation for exactly this type of incident. Armed police officers who had been positioned throughout the area were receiving radio alerts about the developing situation. CCTV operators in secure control rooms were zooming in on the struggle, providing real-time intelligence to response teams that were already converging on the palace gates. But the response, professional as it was, would take time to coordinate and deploy. In the meantime, Marcus and James remained locked in their desperate struggle, each man fighting not just for control of a weapon, but for fundamentally different visions of justice, survival, and what constituted acceptable behavior in a civilized society. The crowd around them had grown larger as word of the incident spread through the standard tourist areas. People were pulling out their phones to record what was happening, creating a forest of screens that would ensure this moment was preserved from dozens of different angles. Social media posts were already beginning to appear with hashtags like #Buckingham Palace and #RoyalGuard, spreading news of the incident around the world at the speed of light. Marcus could feel his window of opportunity closing with each passing second, but he was too committed to the attempt to simply walk away. Every muscle in his body was screaming with the effort of trying to overcome James's superior training and conditioning. His grip on the rifle was beginning to slip as perspiration made his palms slick, and he could feel the crowd pressing closer as curiosity overcame caution. James, for his part, was maintaining his professional composure despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. His face remained stoic even as he fought to retain control of his weapon, but behind his controlled exterior, his mind was racing through the possible ways this confrontation could end. Most of the scenarios he could envision involved either his own serious injury or the need to use potentially lethal force against Marcus. The German tourist who had been approaching the struggle finally reached the edge of the confrontation and made a decision that would add another layer of complexity to an already chaotic situation. Without warning, he lunged forward and grabbed Marcus around the waist, attempting to pull him away from James and the rifle. His intentions were clearly to help, but his intervention transformed what had been a two-person struggle into something much more unpredictable. Marcus felt the additional hands grabbing him and panicked. What had been a calculated risk was now spiraling completely out of control, with multiple people involved and no clear path to either success or escape. He tried to twist away from the German tourist's grip while maintaining his hold on the rifle, creating a three-way struggle that was even more chaotic than what had come before. The sound of police sirens was now audible in the distance, their distinctive European wail cutting through the traffic noise of central London. The sound seemed to energize both the struggling men and the watching crowd, adding a sense of urgency and finality to a situation that was already balanced on a knife's edge. James could feel the additional complications threatening to overwhelm his ability to maintain control of the situation. The German tourist's intervention, while well-intentioned, was making it harder for him to use his training effectively. The struggling mass of bodies was creating opportunities for Marcus to get better leverage on the rifle, and James knew that if the weapon was actually dislodged from his control, the consequences would be catastrophic. Marcus's breathing was becoming ragged as the physical exertion and emotional stress of the situation pushed his already weakened body beyond its limits. 3 days without proper food had left him running on adrenaline and desperation alone, and those resources were rapidly being depleted. He could feel his strength beginning to fail just as the stakes were reaching their highest point. The crowd around them had grown into a substantial gathering, with people streaming from all directions to witness what was clearly an unprecedented incident. Tour guides were trying to shepherd their groups away from the developing chaos, while other visitors moved closer to get better photos or videos. The mixture of concern and curiosity was creating a volatile atmosphere that could easily tip into panic. In the distance, the sound of running footsteps on pavement announced the arrival of additional security personnel. Armed police officers were approaching at a full sprint, their equipment bouncing rhythmically as they closed the distance between their previous positions and the site of the struggle. Behind them came palace security guards, communications specialists, and the first elements of what would soon become a massive law enforcement response. The afternoon that had started so peacefully was now rushing toward a conclusion that no one could predict or control. 3 men locked in desperate struggle, surrounded by hundreds of witnesses, with the most famous palace in the world as their backdrop. It was a scene that belonged in fiction rather than reality. But the weight of the rifle in their hands, the sweat on their faces, and the sound of approaching sirens were all undeniably, terrifyingly real. As the struggle continued, each second stretched into an eternity of consequences that would ripple far beyond this single moment. Lives were about to change forever, headlines would be written, and the careful balance of security and accessibility that allowed ordinary people to visit one of Britain's most important symbols was about to face its most serious test in decades. The collision of Marcus's desperation and James's duty had created something unprecedented, and now the entire world was about to watch how it would end.